The silence in the drawing room was a thick, suffocating thing, clinging to the faded damask curtains and the worn threads of the Aubusson carpet. Ilara Vance felt it in her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening creeping through the window panes. She was 24, an age when society deemed a woman a spinster, a relic to be pitied or ignored. The world had moved on, leaving her stranded on the desolate shore of her family's dwindling fortune. Her mother sat opposite, her fan fluttering with a nervous energy that belied her rigid posture. Her gaze kept flicking between Ilara and the man seated beside her, Lord Ashworth. He was a man of middling years, with a florid complexion and hands that seemed too large for his body. He smelled faintly of stale port and overwhelming self-satisfaction. He was their last, desperate hope. Ilara's fingers tightened around the cool porcelain of her teacup. Lord Ashworth had been speaking for 10 minutes, a monologue on the soundness of his investments and the breeding of his hounds. He had not once asked for her opinion. He was not courting her. He was inspecting a property he intended to acquire. She was part of the estate, a necessary but uninteresting fixture. Her heart hammered a slow, funereal rhythm against her ribs. This was her future. A life of polite servitude to a man she could not respect. A life where her mind, which she had so carefully cultivated with books and quiet contemplation, would be left to wither like a vine cut from its root. Despair tasted like ash in her mouth. She had resigned herself to it. There was no other path. A sensible match, her mother had said earlier, her voice thin and strained. He will restore our position, Ilara. You must think of your sister. Her younger sister, Clara, whose own debut was just a season away, depended on this match. The weight of that responsibility was a physical burden, pressing down on Ilara's shoulders until she could barely breathe. Lord Ashworth finally paused, taking a loud sip of his tea. The arrangement would be most beneficial for all parties, he concluded, looking at her mother, not at her. The transaction was nearly complete. Ilara felt invisible, a ghost in her own life story. She was about to offer a strained, meaningless pleasantry when the sound of a carriage arriving on the gravel outside broke the spell. It was an unexpected interruption. They were not expecting any other callers. Her mother frowned, a crease appearing between her brows. The knocker on the front door echoed through the house, a sharp, imperious sound that seemed to brook no delay. Their aging butler, Harris, shuffled past the drawing-room door, his footsteps slow and weary. A moment later, Harris reappeared, his face pale and his expression one of utter shock. He seemed to have shrunk within his worn livery. He stood at the threshold, unable to speak, simply staring into the room with wide, disbelieving eyes. Behind him, a figure filled the doorway, casting a long shadow that swallowed the dim candlelight. He was tall, dressed in impeccably tailored black, his presence so commanding that the very air in the room seemed to grow still and heavy. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She recognised him instantly, as did everyone in London society. It was Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. The Iron Duke. A man spoken of in whispers, a figure of immense power and wealth who moved through the world like a phantom, his face a mask of cold, unreadable discipline. He was a man of shadows and secrets, rarely seen at social gatherings, and never, ever known to make an unsolicited call upon a family of their modest standing. The Duke's eyes, the colour of a winter storm, swept the room, dismissing her mother and Lord Ashworth with an almost imperceptible glance. Then they settled on Ilara. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt seen. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was like being pinned by a shard of ice. He stepped into the room, his movements economical and precise. He did not wait for an invitation. "Lady Alara," he said, his voice a low baritone, smooth and cold as polished granite. It was not a greeting, it was a summons. Her mother rose, flustered, her fan working frantically. "Your Grace, we were not expecting—" The Duke ignored her. His gaze remained fixed on Alara. Lord Ashworth, puffing up with indignation at being so thoroughly overlooked, also stood. "See here," he began, his voice a pompous bluster. "This is a private—" "I have come to make a proposal of marriage to Lady Alara," the Duke stated, cutting through Lord Ashworth's protestations as if they were nothing more than a bothersome insect's buzz. The silence that followed was absolute, a void where sound had ceased to exist. Alara stared at him, certain she had misheard. Her mother's fan stilled. Lord Ashworth's jaw hung slightly agape. The Duke of Blackwood, a man who could have his pick of any debutante in the country, was proposing marriage to her, to Alara Vance, the forgotten spinster. His words fell like stones into the frozen pond of her resignation. He spoke directly to her, a shocking breach of protocol, his eyes never leaving hers. "I require a duchess. You, I am told, require a husband of means. It seems a practical solution to both our predicaments. I will settle your family's debts and provide you with a generous settlement of your own. In return, you will manage my household and provide me with an heir." It was the most unromantic, brutally honest proposal she could ever have imagined. It was not a declaration of affection, but a business contract laid bare. And yet, in its starkness, there was a strange kind of freedom. He was not pretending. He was not offering flowery words to hide a transactional heart. He was simply stating the terms. Lord Ashworth finally found his voice, sputtering with rage. "This is an outrage. An insult. We had an understanding." The Duke turned his head slowly, a minimal movement that was somehow more menacing than a sudden gesture. He levelled a look at Ashworth, a look of such pure, chilling disdain that the other man physically recoiled. "Your understanding is of no consequence to me," the Duke said softly. "The choice belongs to Lady Alara." And there it was, the one thing no one had offered her. A choice. Her gaze shifted from the Duke's impenetrable face to Lord Ashworth's sputtering fury, then to her mother's stunned, calculating expression. Her mother was already weighing the advantages of a duke over a mere lord. Alara was a pawn being traded for a more valuable piece, but the Duke had said the choice was hers. He had placed the power, however fleeting, in her hands. She looked back at him, at the cold, disciplined man who offered her a gilded cage instead of a leaden one. It was still a prison, but the view would be better. And it would be a prison of her own choosing. A small, defiant spark flickered to life within her. She rose from her chair, her movements graceful and deliberate. She felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her. "I accept, Your Grace," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she had heard it in years. The marriage took place 2 weeks later. It was a small, quiet affair, devoid of celebration. Her new home, Blackwood Manor, was a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of stone and shadow, a place as vast and intimidating as its master. Alara walked its silent halls feeling like a ghost, a whisper of a person in a house that seemed to hold its breath. The Duke was true to his word. He was a perfectly polite, perfectly distant husband. They took their meals together in a dining hall so large their voices echoed in the vaulted ceiling. He would inquire after her day with formal courtesy, and she would respond in kind. They were two strangers engaged in a performance for the benefit of the staff. At night, who would come to her chambers, a silent, dutiful shadow. Their intimacy was a quiet, almost reverent act, performed with a detached precision that left her feeling emptier than before. He was gentle, considerate, but his heart remained a locked room, and she had no key. He never stayed the night. As soon as his duty was done, he would retreat to his own wing of the manor, leaving her alone in the cavernous bed with the scent of his soap on the pillows. She tried to fill her days. The Blackwood Library was a treasure trove, a magnificent two-story room filled with thousands of volumes. She lost herself in history and poetry, the words of long-dead authors a more constant companionship than her living husband. She took over the management of the household, a task she found surprisingly satisfying. The staff, initially wary, soon warmed to her quiet competence and fairness. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, a title that carried immense weight and prestige. She wore fine gowns and priceless jewels. She wanted for nothing materially. Yet a profound loneliness settled over her, as pervasive and damp as the morning mist that often shrouded the manor. Slowly, however, she began to notice things. Small, almost imperceptible cracks in the Duke's iron facade. One evening, she came upon him in the library. He was standing by the fire, a book held loosely in one hand, staring into the flames. He did not hear her approach. She saw that his hand, the one holding the book, trembled slightly. The tremor was minute, but in a man of such unshakable control, it was like witnessing a tremor in a mountain. He sensed her presence, and the trembling stopped instantly, his hand becoming steady as stone. He turned, his face the usual impassive mask. "Duchess," he said, a simple acknowledgement, and the moment was gone. But she had seen it. A week later, a package arrived for her. It contained a beautiful, handcrafted wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a complete set of the finest watercolours, sable brushes, and thick, creamy paper. There was no note. When she saw him at dinner, she thanked him for the thoughtful gift. He merely inclined his head. "The steward mentioned you had inquired about art supplies in the village," he said, his tone flat. "It seemed a simple matter to procure them." He offered no other explanation, but she remembered the conversation with the steward had been a brief, passing one weeks ago. He had remembered. He had acted upon it. The thought was a small, warm stone in the cold expanse of her chest. The most significant change came in the form of the garden. Behind the west wing of the manor lay a walled garden, forgotten and overgrown for decades. Ilara had stumbled upon it one afternoon, a secret, wild place, choked with weeds and tangled vines. She had mentioned it in passing to her maid, Martha, remarking on what a beautiful, peaceful place it must have once been. 2 days later, she awoke to the sound of work. From her window, she saw a team of gardeners descending upon the walled garden, their tools flashing in the morning sun. They worked for weeks, clearing the overgrowth, turning the soil, and restoring the crumbling stone paths. Then, cartloads of flowers began to arrive. Roses of every shade, lavender, delphiniums, and dozens of other varieties she could not name. No one said a word to her about it. When she asked the head gardener, he simply said, "The Duke's orders, Your Grace." Alistair never mentioned it, but one evening, as she stood on the newly laid path, breathing in the fragrant air of her restored sanctuary, she looked up at the manor. She saw him, standing in the window of his study, watching her. Their eyes met across the distance. He did not smile, but he did not look away. He simply watched her, and in that silent gaze, she felt something shift, a silent acknowledgement that this space was for her. Their new life, this strange, silent partnership, was tested at the annual Stirling Ball, the pinnacle of the London season. It was the first time they had appeared in public as a married couple, and Alara felt the weight of hundreds of curious eyes upon them. She knew what they were whispering. They saw the penniless spinster who had somehow snared the country's most eligible and enigmatic duke. She stood by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. His presence was a formidable shield. No one dared approach them with anything but the most fawning respect. Yet, she could feel the undercurrent of malice, particularly from a group of women led by Lady Beatrice Finch, a celebrated beauty who had once been considered the most likely candidate for the position Alara now held. Later in the evening, the Duke was drawn into a conversation with a government minister, leaving Alara momentarily alone near the terrace. It was the opportunity Lady Beatrice had been waiting for. She glided over, her smile as sharp and beautiful as a shard of glass. "Duchess," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "One must congratulate you. It is quite a feat to rise so far so fast. I imagine your family is quite relieved to have you so profitably settled." The insult was clear, wrapped in the guise of a compliment. Alara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, but she lifted her chin, refusing to let the woman see her discomfort. "My family is very happy for me, Lady Beatrice," she replied, her own voice cool and even. Lady Beatrice's smile tightened. "Of course they are. To have their debts cleared and their daughter installed at Blackwood, it is a fairy tale. The Duke is known for his astute acquisitions. He must have seen great value in the arrangement." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell me, is he as cold in the marriage bed as he is in the ballroom?" The cruelty of the question stole the air from Alara's lungs. It was a vicious, public humiliation. Before she could form a response, a voice, quiet and deadly as a winter frost, cut through the air behind her. "I find my wife's company to be the only source of warmth in rooms such as this." Alistair was there. He had appeared as if from nowhere, his body a rigid line of fury behind her. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and protective. His eyes were fixed on Lady Beatrice, and the coldness in them was no longer passive. It was a lethal, focused weapon. Lady Beatrice paled, her carefully constructed composure shattering. The small crowd that had gathered to witness the exchange fell silent, their expressions a mixture of shock and fear. "Lady Beatrice," the Duke continued, his voice dangerously soft, "I would have thought a woman of your breeding would know better than to mistake a lack of frivolous chatter for a lack of feeling. You have just demonstrated that the opposite is also true. A great deal of chatter can exist in the complete absence of intellect or kindness." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You will apologise to my wife." It was not a request, it was a command. Humiliated and outmanoeuvred, Lady Beatrice stammered a hasty, insincere apology to Alara and fled, her friends scattering in her wake. Alistair did not watch her go. His attention was entirely on Alara. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing its sharp edge. A low murmur meant only for her. She could only nod, her throat tight with a swirl of conflicting emotions. She was shaken, angry, but also stunned by the ferocity of his defence. He had protected her. The Iron Duke, her cold and distant husband, had publicly defended her honour with a swift, brutal efficiency that left her breathless. He guided her away from the gawking onlookers toward the quiet of the terrace. The cool night air was a relief against her heated skin. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The music from the ballroom seemed a world away.
"Thank you,"
she finally whispered, looking out at the manicured gardens below. She had no right to speak to you that way, he said. It was a simple statement of fact. She turned to look at him then, really look at him. In the moonlight, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. She saw not the powerful Duke, but a man who had just revealed a sliver of the fire that burned beneath the ice. "Why did you do it?" she asked, the question more pointed than she intended. "It was not part of our arrangement." His jaw tightened. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "You are the Duchess of Blackwood," he said, his voice strained. "An insult to you is an insult to my name." It was the answer she expected, the one that pushed her away, reinforcing the walls of their contract. And yet, it did not feel like the entire truth. The fury she had seen in his eyes was not about his name. It had been personal. The discovery left her more confused than ever. He was a man of contradictions, a puzzle she could not solve. And the uncertainty was beginning to wear on her soul. The months that followed the Sterling ball settled back into their quiet, formal rhythm, but something had irrevocably changed for Alara. The seed of confusion planted that night had taken root, growing into a restless dissatisfaction. The polite distance that had once been a bearable condition of her new life now felt like a constant, grating friction against her spirit. She had a beautiful home, security, and a husband who, in his own baffling way, protected her. But she was not a partner. She was a well-cared-for possession, the Duchess of Blackwood, a title, not a person. The silence in the manor no longer felt peaceful. It felt empty. The loneliness she had known her whole life had followed her here, taking on a new, more poignant form because companionship was so close, yet entirely out of reach. She found herself watching him, searching for more cracks in his armour. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes late at night, the way he would rub the back of his neck when he thought no one was looking. She saw him standing alone in the portrait gallery, his gaze fixed on the image of a young man with a laughing face, his older brother, the one he had never been meant to succeed. She saw a deep, abiding sorrow in him, a loneliness that mirrored her own. But he never spoke of it. He never offered a single word of his own fears or griefs. The walls around him were as solid and impenetrable as the stone of the manor itself. And she realised, with a sudden, painful clarity, that she could not live this way. She could not spend the rest of her life as a spectator to her own marriage, waiting for a man to let her in when he had no intention of ever opening the door. The decision, when it came, was not born of anger, but of a profound and quiet sadness. It was an act of self-preservation. She deserved more than this gilded silence. She would rather face poverty and uncertainty as her own person than live as a ghost in someone else's life. She waited for a week when he was scheduled to be in London on ducal business. She packed a single, small valise with a few simple dresses, her art supplies, and the small amount of money she had from her personal allowance. She wrote him a letter, her hand steady as she dipped the pen in ink. "Your Grace," she wrote, "I am grateful for the security you have provided me. I have endeavoured to be the Duchess you required. However, I find I cannot continue in this arrangement. It is not a life I am suited for. I release you from our contract. I will not be a burden to you, and I ask only that you do not look for me." She signed it simply, Alara. She left the letter on the pillow of her vast, empty bed. Her maid, Martha, was the only one she confided in. The loyal woman cried, begging her to reconsider, but Alara was resolute. Martha helped her slip out of the house unnoticed, arranging for a seat on the morning coach to a small coastal town where no one would know her name. Her plan was simple. She would find a small cottage to rent. She would sell her watercolours. It would be a difficult, humble existence, but it would be hers. The thought of it was terrifying, yet it filled her with the first flicker of genuine hope she had felt in years. The night before her departure, a storm rolled in from the north, lashing the manor with wind and rain. A message arrived by a mud-spattered courier. The Duke's business had concluded early. He was riding back from London and would arrive before midnight. Panic seized her. Her carefully laid plan was unravelling. She could not wait until morning. She had to leave now, tonight, before he returned. She retrieved her packed valise from its hiding place. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. There was no turning back. She slipped through the sleeping house, a single candle lighting her way. The halls were filled with menacing shadows that danced and writhed in the flickering light. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She made her way down the grand staircase, her hand trailing on the cold, polished wood of the banister. The great entrance hall was a cavern of darkness, the moonlight blotted out by the storm. Her valise felt impossibly heavy in her hand. She reached the massive oak door, the final barrier between her prison and her freedom. Her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, closed around the cold, heavy brass of the handle. She had her hand on the door. She had made her peace with leaving. And then he spoke. "Where are you going, Alara?" His voice came from the shadows near the base of the staircase. It was not the cold, formal tone she was used to. It was raw, strained, stripped of all its ducal authority. It was the voice of a man. She froze, her hand clamped to the door handle. Her whole plan fell apart. She turned slowly. He stepped out of the darkness, his riding clothes soaked from the storm, his hair plastered to his forehead. He was not the immaculate Iron Duke. He looked weary, dishevelled, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, wounded expression she had never seen before. His gaze dropped from her face to the valise in her hand, and something in his expression shattered. "You are leaving," he stated. It was not a question. It was a statement of devastating fact. She found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "I cannot stay. I cannot live like this." "Like what?" he asked, taking a step toward her. "You have everything. This house, the title, anything you could ever desire." "I do not desire any of it." The words burst from her, louder than she intended, filled with all the months of pent-up loneliness and frustration. "I want a life, Alistair, not an arrangement. I want a partner, not a guardian. I am a ghost in this house, a ghost in my own marriage." He stopped, stung by her words as if by a physical blow. He looked utterly lost, his formidable composure completely gone, washed away by the storm and her revelation. I do not understand," he stammered. "I have tried to give you what you wanted." "You gave me a garden," she said, her voice breaking. "You gave me paints. You defended me from a cruel woman. You give me things, Alistair. But you have never given me yourself. You have never spoken a single true word to me. Do you even know the colour of my eyes? Do you know what I fear in the dead of night? Do you know me at all?" He stared at her, and the silence stretched between them, thick with the sound of the raging storm outside and the frantic beating of her own heart. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For the first time, she saw not a duke, but a man drowning in a sorrow so deep She could feel its pull from across the hall.
"They are the colour of heather in the late summer gloaming," he said, his voice so quiet she almost did not hear him. He lifted his head, and his eyes, stormy and filled with unshed tears, met hers. "And you fear being forgotten. You fear that you will live your entire life without ever truly being seen." Ilara was so stunned she could not speak. He did see her. He had been watching, all this time, from behind his impenetrable walls. He took another hesitant step, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I know," he began, his voice cracking with an emotion she could not name. "I know because I have watched you since the first day I ever saw you. It was 5 years ago, at your first season. I was a second son then, with no title and no prospects, just a shy, awkward boy hiding in the corner of a ballroom. You were talking to your father about a book of poetry. You were so alive, so intelligent. You shone." The confession hung in the air between them, more shocking than his proposal had been. "I wanted to speak to you," he continued, his words a torrent now, as if a dam had finally broken. "Every day for that entire season, I tried to find the courage, but I could not. I was a coward. And then my brother, he died. And everything changed. The title, the duties, the grief. It was a weight I thought would crush me. I built walls to survive it. I became this cold, disciplined thing. The Iron Duke." He gestured around the vast, dark hall. "This was my prison long before it was yours. When I heard your family was ruined, that Ashworth was circling, I knew I could not stand by and let you be sold to a man like that. But the coward was still there. I was terrified that if I told you the truth, if I confessed that I had loved you from afar for 5 years, you would laugh at me or pity me. So I offered you the only thing I thought I had of value, a practical solution. A contract. It was the only way I knew how to bring you into my life, to keep you safe." "It was a coward's bargain."
He stood before her, stripped bare of all his titles and defences. He was just a man, lonely and afraid, who had made a terrible mistake out of love and fear. The coldness she had endured was not indifference, it was terror. The silence was not emptiness, it was a heart screaming behind a locked door. He looked at her, at the bag in her hand, at the door behind her. The hope in his eyes died, replaced by a devastating resignation. He believed he was too late. He had revealed his heart only at the exact moment she had chosen to leave. She was still holding the door handle. Freedom was inches away. But the world she had planned to escape to suddenly seemed bleak and colourless compared to the vibrant, painful, beautiful truth standing before her. All her loneliness, all her sorrow, she saw it reflected in him. They were two lonely souls who had been living parallel lives under the same roof. He saw her hesitation and misunderstood it. He thought she was merely pausing before the final act of departure. He gave a single, wretched nod, accepting his fate. "I understand," he whispered. He turned as if to walk away, to give her the freedom to leave without having to witness his pain. As he turned, 4 words fell from his lips, not meant for her, perhaps, but for the empty hall, for the ghosts of his own regrets. A final, broken plea. "Please, do not leave me." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were not a duke's command. They were the desperate cry of a man on the verge of losing everything that mattered to him. In that moment, her choice became startlingly clear. She was not choosing between a prison and freedom. She was choosing between a life of solitude and the terrifying, wonderful possibility of being loved. Her fingers uncurled from the brass handle. With a soft thud, she set her valise down on the marble floor. The sound was small, but it echoed in the cavernous hall like a gavel falling, a final judgment rendered. He stopped, his back still to her. He did not dare to turn, did not dare to hope. She took a step toward him, and then another. She walked across the cold floor until she was standing just behind him. She reached out a hesitant hand, not to his arm, but to his clenched fist. She gently laid her fingers over his. His hand was ice cold, that he did not pull away. A tremor ran through him. Slowly, tentatively, he unclenched his fist, his fingers lacing with hers. He turned his head, and she saw the glimmer of tears tracking paths through the grime on his face. She did not need to say a word. Her choice was in her touch. It was in the simple act of staying. The storm raged on outside, but within the walls of the great, silent house, the rain had finally stopped. A year later, the walled garden was a riot of colour and life. Sunlight, warm and golden, spilled over the old stone, chasing away the last of the shadows. Ilara sat on a stone bench, a sketchbook open on her lap, but her charcoal pencil was still. She was watching her husband. Alistair was on his knees in the dirt, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, showing her the proper way to stake a climbing rose. He was laughing, a deep, genuine sound that she had come to cherish more than any jewel. The formidable Iron Duke was gone, replaced by a man who found joy in the simple act of tending a garden with his wife. Their new beginning had been slow and awkward at first. Learning to talk, to share the small, quiet moments of a life, was a language neither of them knew well. But they had learned together, word by word, touch by touch. He had shown her his brother's portrait and told her stories of their childhood. She had read him her favourite poems in the library, her head resting on his shoulder before the fire. The vast, cold manor had slowly begun to feel like a home, filled not with silence, but with a comfortable, companionable peace. He finished with the rose and came to sit beside her on the bench, wiping the soil from his hands. He leaned over and kissed her, a soft, easy gesture that was now as natural as breathing. "What are you drawing?" he asked, glancing at the blank page. "I was just thinking," she said, her fingers lacing with his. His hand was warm now, always warm. "About how a place can be a prison or a sanctuary. It all depends on whether you are locked in or willingly stay." He squeezed her hand, his gaze full of a love that still, after all this time, made her breath catch. He understood. He knew she had not stayed for the title or the fortune. She had stayed for him. She had chosen him. True freedom, she had learned, was not about walking out a door. It was about having the courage to stay, to tear down the walls, and to build a new life, together, in the space you created. It was never too late to begin again.